Hi, this is CS Professor Pam with Jumpstart Code, and let us continue our study of CSS. We are working through content in internetingishard.com, and we are currently working through the box model, the CSS box model, which is lesson 5 here. The box model helps us to understand how we format our content, and the box model has these elements involved. You have your content, you have space, you can configure space around your content, which is called padding. You can configure a border, which is around the padding. And then there is also space outside of the border, which is margin. So these are 4 very important elements to be aware of. We are working on a file that is this file, boxes.html, and this content has a header and it has a couple of paragraphs, and we have already discussed the difference between block elements and inline elements, and we have also worked on adding padding. So we are currently at the point of this lesson where we are talking about the border. Now, borders are really interesting and useful. You can use them a lot of times when you are trying to kind of figure out what's going on with your layout, because it allows you to see exactly what your element looks like. All right, so when we set up a border, there are 3 components to a border: the size of the border, the style of the border, and the color of the border. So let's set up on our H1 here. We're going to set up a border, and this border is 1 pixel in width. We're making it solid, and then here is the color. So borders can be solid, they can be dotted, they can be dashed. There are a lot of different ways to configure them. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to add this to the CSS for our H1. So here's my H1. Currently it has padding around it, and I am setting up a border. All right, so here's my page. Let's save all, and you'll see what just happened. We added a border around this content. So that helps me to understand, exactly what space is the padding, because the padding is inside of the border, and what space is the margin, because the margin is outside of the border. Now, just to show you a couple of other things before we do this, you can change the size of this border. If I make it 5 pixels, for example, then you'll see that it is a heavier border, right? And there's also borders that can be dashed or dotted. So you'll see that's a dashed border. There's also a dotted border. So there's a lot of ways to configure it. Let me take it back to what we were working on, which is just a solid border. All right, and we see that. All right, now if you don't only want the border in one particular element, you may not want it around the entire element. Just like padding, we can control top, bottom, left, and right. So if I change this to border bottom, then we will only see the border at the bottom of our page. The bottom of this element. Right? So the border is only here at the bottom. So you can use this sometimes, as part of your styling. So for example, if I make this a little heavier, right? That could be part of my styling that I am applying to this page. So again, you are in complete control of the aesthetics of how your page looks, right? And when it comes to that, you really have to have a lot of patience, because CSS has so many different properties and things that you can control. And so the best thing to do is work on one thing at a time. All right, now, borders can also be really useful to help debug. Again, if you're not quite sure what's going on, I do this all the time. Just add a border around that particular element, and you'll be able to clearly see what your element looks like. And after you sort that out, you can just delete that rule. Now, so we talked about padding, which is outside of the content but inside of the border. We can also control the space outside of a border. So that is margin. All right, so let's look at what we have right now. We have these paragraph elements, and you can see there's not too much space between them. Maybe I want to space them out a little bit more. So let's add a bottom margin to the paragraphs. So I've got this padding, and I'm going to add this margin. Again, it's really useful as you do things to be able to see the cause and effect. All right, so I'm going to have this up here. When I save all, right, look at what happened. The space between these paragraphs changed, right? And if we go and inspect this a little bit, as I told you before, you can right click on your page. I'm going to close this up and do this again. If I right click and inspect, then we want to go to the computed tab here, and you want to be in elements tab here. You're able to see. So if I go to this paragraph, for example, so this is this particular paragraph, then what I'm seeing down here is the layout, and you can see that we've got 50 pixels of margin at the bottom of this paragraph. If I go to the other paragraph, we can see 50 pixels of margin at the bottom of that, right? And you can also click here to get to an element and see what's going on. All right, and our paragraphs right now have, remember we have padding of 20 pixels top and bottom. So there's my padding, there's no border, and here is my margin outside of that. All right, so we've put a margin on the bottom. Now, margin and padding, they can both sometimes, they both basically help you get spacing between your content. And in programming, there is seldom one and only one right way to do things. So the idea is just make sure you're getting the effect that you're looking for. There might be more than one way to accomplish that. So if you have background color, you have to realize the padding will always be included in that background color. Margins will not. If you're clicking an element, padding will be included in the click element of that area, of that element. And margins are going to collapse. We're going to talk about that here soon, but padding doesn't. So, and again, pick one. There's often more than one way to solve your problem. All right, now, to understand a little bit more about how block elements are handled as differently from inline elements. So inline elements deal with margin in a very different way. They completely ignore the top and bottom margins. So let's add a big margin to our strong element. Remember, we have this element here. This inline is a strong element. So I'm going to copy this rule, add it here. All right, let me have my page up so we can kind of see what happens when I save. So we're trying to add a margin of 50 pixels around this element. All right, I'm going to put it over here so we can see. Save all. And look at what happened. So we have this margin to the left and the right, okay? But it doesn't affect the vertical space at all, right? The margin is only around the left and the right. And if I go in here and look at this element, we'll be able to see that. If I go in here, we've got this margin. It sort of looks like it's on all sides, but it really only affects the left and the right for an inline element, right? If we change it to padding, so let's go over here and change margin to padding. Bring my page up over here so I can see what happens. Right, so then it seems to affect the entire element, but it sure kind of wreaks havoc on the rest of what's going on. So basically, when you are playing around with vertical spacing of an element, you really must be working with block level elements, okay? So you can, and remember, you can change your display property if you need to do that. Now, there's a little quirk of the box model, which is called vertical margin collapse. So let's say I have two boxes with vertical margins right next to each other. You would probably think that they would add them together. So, but it turns out that it doesn't. So remember, I'm going to go back to my paragraph. So let me get rid of this padding on here. We don't want that anymore. Let's just save and double check and make sure all is good. All right, so remember, we set up, we're going to add a top margin of 25 pixels to our P element. Remember, we already have a bottom margin, so we're going to also add a top margin, which is different. Right? Now, if I look at my page here, so I've got two paragraphs, right? And I'm saying that they should both have a top margin of 25 and a bottom margin of 50. So I would expect 25 to go before this P, 50 after, and 25 before the second P. So I would probably expect that there would be 75 pixels between these two paragraphs, right? But it kind of doesn't look that way, all right? But it turns out there's still only going to be 50 pixels between them because the smaller one basically collapses into the larger one. Let's see if we can see that over here. So if I go to this paragraph, we've got top margin of 25 and we've got bottom margin of 50. You can see the pink there is the space around it. And if I go to the other paragraph and I'm looking at the margin, so it looks like 25 and 50 after, but realize here's 25, right? And this one has 25. So basically there's 50 between them. So the margins have collapsed, right? And sometimes things like this can happen and you get a little confused about it. Sometimes this is useful because sometimes you're trying to define the minimum space between elements, but it can also be annoying. And if you don't want this to happen, this is a little trick. Sometimes you basically put an invisible element in between them to break them up. So I'm going to take this element. This is a div element. We'll talk about it more later, but a div is basically just a generic box. And what I'm going to do is put that div between these two paragraphs. Just kind of an invisible element, because notice it has some inline styling here that is saying that it has top padding of 1 pixel. All right, so just by adding that, remember here's what my spacing looks like right now. I'm going to save all. And now I can see that extra space here, right? Now, if I go here and we inspect this paragraph, then I've got the 25 before and the 50 after, right? And notice this div is in between. It's kind of showing me over here. When I highlight it here, you can see it there. And now when I go to the paragraph after, we see the 25 before. So we've got 25 margin before the second paragraph, and I've got 50 after this paragraph. So that's giving me a total of 75 pixels between these two paragraphs, right? So again, this can happen when you have, this two of the same elements right next to each other collapsing together. If you put an element in there with a non-zero height, that's why we gave it a padding of 1 pixel, then we get the entire, the total bottom margin and the top margin, okay? But padding doesn't collapse. So this is a case where maybe you would want to use padding to space out the paragraphs instead of margins. All right. And when we learn about something called Flexbox, we really won't have to worry about this very much at all. Okay. So we have now talked about the elements of the box model, which again are the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. And what I would really recommend again is, as you are working on making your page look nice, just focus on one of these elements at a time. If you add padding and margin at the same time, sometimes you're not quite sure what's affecting what. So just focus on adding one of them at a time, and always make the change, look at your page, and think about the cause and effect, because that is the important thing in programming, is that you make some change in your code and there is an effect to your page, and you have to make sure you understand that.